The bridge rose under the explosion. Then it dropped back onto its piers, still standing. 25 days later, that failure helped trap 317,000 German soldiers in the Ruhr. A bridge that should have vanished into the Rhine became the open door into Germany, and the first bar of a cage around Army Group B. By March 1945, the Western Allies had fought their way to the Rhine along almost its entire length. The river was Germany's last great natural barrier in the West, broad, fast, and deep, with steep approaches in many sectors and every usable crossing marked for destruction. German orders were simple. No bridge was to survive long enough for Allied troops to use it. On March 7, leading elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division entered Remagen, a small town south of Bonn. Their assigned mission was not to seize a bridge. They were supposed to clear the West Bank and keep moving. Then the men looked down toward the river. The Ludendorff Railroad Bridge was still there. It was a black steel structure stretching across the Rhine toward the tunnel at Erpel. German engineers had packed it with explosives. Demolition cables ran along the span. The bridge was guarded, mined, and already under fire, but it had not been destroyed. The Americans had only minutes to decide whether the site in front of them was a gift or a trap. Brigadier General William Hoge, commanding Combat Command B, made the decision immediately. He ordered tanks into positions that could fire along the bridge and sent infantry down through Remagen toward the western approach. The Germans triggered the demolitions. A smaller charge blew a crater near the approach. Then the main explosion struck beneath the bridge. Steel lifted. Dust and smoke swallowed the span. When the cloud opened, the Ludendorff Bridge was damaged, but standing. The explosive system had failed. Some charges did not fire, others were too weak, poorly placed, or disconnected in the confusion. Whatever the exact combination, the result was the same. The last intact bridge in that sector had refused to die. American infantry ran onto it under machine gun, rifle, and artillery fire. Engineers followed, cutting wires, throwing unexploded charges into the river, and patching damage while the fight was still moving across the steel beneath them. There was no guarantee the bridge would remain upright. There was no guarantee the Germans would not detonate a second charge. There was no guarantee the men crossing would have a road back. They crossed anyway. By nightfall, American troops held ground on the east bank of the Rhine. Tanks began creeping over after dark, one at a time, the structure groaning under their weight. For the first time in the campaign, a major Allied force had entered Germany across the Rhine with a bridge behind it. Berlin reacted with fury. Hitler treated the loss as betrayal. A flying court-martial was sent to punish the officers blamed for failing to destroy the crossing. Several were convicted and executed. But punishment could not put the bridgehead back in the river. Hour after hour, men, ammunition, vehicles, engineers, and anti-aircraft guns moved across. When German aircraft attacked, American guns filled the sky above the valley. When artillery found the bridge, engineers repaired the damage. When the Germans sent mines, swimmers, and explosive craft downstream, nets and patrols guarded the temporary crossings taking shape beside it. The bridge itself lasted only 10 more days. On March 17, weakened by the original blast, repeated attacks, heavy traffic, and constant repair work, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed into the Rhine while hundreds of engineers were on it. 28 American soldiers were killed. Dozens more were injured. But by then, the bridge was no longer the whole story. The Americans had built alternate crossings. 5 divisions had moved into the bridgehead. The foothold east of the Rhine was deep enough to survive without the steel span that had created it. The physical bridge fell. The door it had opened stayed open. Beyond that door lay the Ruhr. The Ruhr was not just another region on the map. It was the industrial engine of the German war effort. Coal mines, coke plants, rail yards, machine works, chemical plants, and steel mills crowded into a dense belt of cities and factory towns. Essen, Dortmund, Bochum, Duisburg, Gelsenkirchen. For years, the basin had produced the fuel, steel, weapons, and machinery that kept German armies in the field. Allied bombing had damaged it badly, but its strategic value remained enormous. It was still the arsenal of the Reich, and it was still protected by the largest German force left in the West. A direct assault into the Ruhr would have been ugly. The ground favored defense. Canals cut across the approaches. Rail embankments became ready-made walls. Factory complexes offered concrete positions. Rubble blocked streets. Every town could become a fortress, and millions of civilians were still living among the ruins. General Omar Bradley saw no reason to fight through that maze from the front. He wanted to go around it. The plan was not to capture the Ruhr city by city. The plan was to close the exits and turn the whole industrial basin into a pocket. The southern jaw already existed at Remagen. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges's First Army could expand east from the bridgehead. then turn north behind the Ruhr. The northern jaw would come from the lower Rhine near Wesel. There, Lieutenant General William Simpson's Ninth Army crossed in the massive Allied operation launched on March 23 and 24. A deliberate assault supported by thousands of guns, airborne landings, engineers, assault boats, and bridging units. From those two bridgeheads, the American armies would drive past the Ruhr rather than into it. First Army would arc northeast. Ninth Army would drive east, then swing southeast. If they met behind the basin, every German formation between them and the Rhine would be sealed inside, and the man trapped in the middle would be Field Marshal Walter Model. Model had built his reputation on defensive crises. On the Eastern Front, he had repeatedly been sent to sectors where German lines were collapsing. He was known as Hitler's fireman, the commander called in when the map was already burning. He had also helped stop the Allied airborne offensive at Arnhem in September 1944. That success mattered because it shaped the expectations of both sides. Model had already broken one Allied attempt to vault the Rhine. Now he was being asked to defend the river, the Ruhr, and the western approaches to Germany at the same time. But the army he commanded in March 1945 was no longer the army that had fought at Arnhem. Army Group B had spent its reserves in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had consumed tanks, fuel, ammunition, replacement troops, and experienced officers Germany could not replace. Divisions that still looked powerful on paper were hollow in the field. Some had too few vehicles to move. Some had men but almost no ammunition. Some had weapons but no fuel. Others had been rebuilt with training units, anti-aircraft crews, police detachments, older reservists, Volkssturm militia, and teenage boys. The titles remained. The army underneath them was coming apart. Model understood the danger before the ring closed. The Germans facing Simpson in the north could slow an armored column at a canal, a roadblock, or the edge of a town. They could not stop an army moving with overwhelming artillery, air support, fuel, and transport. Ninth Army broke out of the Wesel bridgehead and drove across open country. Its armored spearheads moved faster than German headquarters could rebuild a line in front of them. To the south, First Army surged out of the Remagen bridgehead. Hodges pushed east through the Lahn Valley, then bent the advance north. On the map, the two American fronts began to curve toward one another. Between them was a narrowing corridor. Every German officer who looked at the situation could see the same thing. The only road out of the Ruhr ran east, and every hour that road grew narrower. Model asked for permission to withdraw Army Group B while the gap was still open. A timely withdrawal would have abandoned the Ruhr, but it might have saved much of the army. The troops could have escaped east, shortened the line, and joined the defense of central Germany. Hitler refused. The Ruhr had been declared a fortress. Its industry was to be held. The army inside it was ordered to stand. The decision did not save the Ruhr. It converted the Ruhr into a cage. On Easter Sunday, April 1, 1945, American columns approached the town of Lippstadt from opposite directions. One force belonged to Ninth Army, driving down from the north. The other belonged to First Army, coming up from the south. Just after noon, the columns made contact on the road east of town. There was no grand ceremony. A few vehicles stopped. Soldiers shook hands. Officers confirmed positions. Radios carried the message back to headquarters. The gap was closed. Behind that meeting point, Army Group B was cut off from the rest of Germany. The Ruhr pocket had formed. It stretched across a dense oval of industrial country roughly 75 miles long, and at its widest about 30 miles across. Inside were the 5th Panzer Army, the 15th Army, Corps headquarters, remnants of nearly 20 divisions, local defense units, supply troops, naval personnel, police, Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians and forced laborers moving through the wreckage of the Reich. The Germans called it Fortress Ruhr. The word fortress implied walls, stockpiles, and a plan. What existed on the ground was something else. Rail lines had been smashed. Fuel dumps were nearly empty. Ammunition could not be moved where it was needed. Communications failed as headquarters shifted and cables were cut. Units lost contact with the formations beside them. Orders arrived after the roads named in them had already been taken. The region contained some of the greatest industrial plants in Europe, but an encircled factory cannot feed an army. A blast furnace cannot replace gasoline. A machine shop cannot reopen a road. The arsenal of Germany had become a warehouse with every door locked from the outside. For the civilians inside, the danger was immediate. The Ruhr had already endured years of bombing. Families lived in cellars, damaged apartment blocks, shelters, and half-standing houses. To defend every city to the last street would bring the final battle into the middle of one of Europe's most crowded industrial regions. Model had spent years serving a regime that demanded obedience and destruction. He had enforced brutal warfare in the East and remained loyal to Hitler long after the outcome was clear. Now the orders reaching him demanded one more act of destruction: hold the Ruhr, wreck what could not be held, and continue the fight among German civilians. He did not openly surrender, but he also did not carry out the full destruction Hitler demanded. The Americans tightened the ring. Bradley did not need to throw every available formation into a single frontal storm. He could compress the pocket methodically while sending other armies deeper into Germany. 1st and 9th Army divisions pressed inward from multiple directions. They captured crossings, cut roads, split formations, and forced local commanders to choose between surrender and isolation. The fighting was uneven. At one canal line, German troops resisted until their ammunition was gone. In the next town, officials raised white flags before the first American tank entered the square. Some units fought with discipline for a day, then vanished into woods or surrendered in groups. Others dissolved before contact, the soldiers discarding weapons and trying to reach home. The pocket did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It broke in thousands of smaller decisions. A battalion commander looked at his last fuel trucks. A mayor looked at the houses behind his barricades. A teenage Volkssturm boy looked at an American tank. A wounded soldier looked at the road west. Each choice removed one more piece from the German defense. By the second week of April, the oval was shrinking fast. American armored columns moved through the valleys and along the industrial roads, cutting the trapped force into fragments. German radio networks became erratic. Corps headquarters could no longer direct divisions. Divisions could no longer find all their regiments. Some formations existed only as names on reports. Prisoners came in by the hundreds, then by the thousands. American units often had too few guards, too few trucks, and too little space to process them. Small groups of riflemen were assigned to escort columns of prisoners many times their own size. The Germans kept marching because there was nowhere else to go. On April 14, American forces drove across the pocket and joined again near the Ruhr River, splitting the encirclement into eastern and western sections. The cage now had a wall through its center. Whatever remained of Model's command structure broke with it. The eastern section began to collapse almost immediately. The western section followed. Entire formations surrendered because they had no ammunition, no food, no fuel, and no operational reason to continue. The scale became visible on the roads. German soldiers marched in columns that stretched beyond sight. Officers walked beside enlisted men. Tank crews came without tanks. Anti-aircraft gunners came without guns. Men from divisions that had once crossed Europe now carried blankets, mess tins, and little else. American intelligence had expected perhaps 150,000 prisoners from the pocket. The final total reached roughly 317,000, including 24 generals. It was one of the largest mass surrenders of German troops in the war, and it happened in less than 3 weeks. For Model, the collapse created a final contradiction. He would not sign the surrender of Army Group B Major General Matthew Ridgway, whose 18 Airborne Corps was attacking the pocket, sent an appeal under a flag of truce. The message urged Model to end a battle that had already been decided and spare the men under his command. Model refused. He cited his oath and his honor as a German field marshal. But the same man who rejected formal surrender also rejected a final suicidal defense of the Ruhr. He would not become another Friedrich Paulus, publicly capitulating with an army. He would not obey Hitler by sacrificing every remaining soldier and civilian in a battle with no military purpose. So he chose a third path. Model dissolved Army Group B. He released the oldest and youngest men. He told subordinate commanders to make their own decisions. Units were free to surrender, attempt to escape, or simply go home if they could. He did not sign away the Army Group. He removed the Army Group from existence. The distinction mattered to him. To the soldiers entering American captivity, it changed nothing. On April 18, organized resistance in the Ruhr pocket ended. The Western Allies had eliminated the last major German field force defending the industrial heartland. The Ruhr was lost. The Rhine line was gone. Central Germany lay open. The strategic effect was larger than the pocket itself. While American units processed the surrender, other formations kept driving east. German resistance across the Western Front was breaking into isolated local battles with no coherent reserve behind them. On April 25, American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe near Torgau, cutting Germany in two. The army that might have slowed the Western advance was no longer on the map. It was marching west in captivity. The prisoners were gathered in temporary enclosures and transit camps along and beyond the Rhine. The numbers overwhelmed every forecast. Fences, food, shelter, sanitation, medical care, and transport all had to be improvised for an enemy force that had surrendered faster than the system could absorb it. For the German soldiers, the war ended in long columns, open fields, and the shock of being alive after a regime had ordered them to die in place. For the Ruhr, the fighting ended among wrecked factories and shattered cities whose industrial power had once armed conquest across Europe. For Model, there would be no prison camp. The regime he had served denounced the surrendering men of Army Group B as traitors. Model knew he could not reach another German army. He also knew capture could bring interrogation and prosecution for his conduct in the occupied East. On April 21, 3 days after the pocket ceased organized resistance, he entered a wooded area south of Duisburg and took his own life. The man Hitler had called whenever a front was burning had run out of fronts. 6 weeks earlier, the Rhine had still appeared to be a wall. Then one demolition failed at Remagen. That single failure did not defeat Germany by itself. Allied armies, engineers, air power, logistics, and overwhelming material strength did that. But the intact bridge changed the tempo. It put First Army across the Rhine before the German command was ready. It gave Bradley a southern jaw for the envelopment. It forced Army Group B to defend the Ruhr, while another crossing opened to the north. It turned a river barrier into a road, and that road became part of a ring. The bridge at Remagen opened the door. The road at Lippstadt closed the cage.